Don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, you're too arrogant. And if you don't change your ways, I will rise up and break the backbone of your power.
Otep, this is Femi here with Freedom Now, and your ears are in tuned at high frequencies in a liberated zone. Freedom Now is a Pan-Africanist, global news outlet from coast to coast, dispelling the Western propaganda media and their all lies point of views. Freedom Now is devoted to relay true news, views, and proper clues to form solutions around freedom for the oppressed worldwide. Now, get relaxed, grab a pen, and phone a friend, because Freedom Now is set to begin to awaken deep sleepers dreaming about freedom now, within, and freedom now, in.
Habari gani. Thank you to all who donated to support KPFK during our recent fund drive. We thank you deeply for your contributions. This is Sister Thage with Freedom Now's agenda for this Farce of July weekend 2024. The Farce of July is a term used by the resistance to the U.S. imperialism's claims of independence on the stolen land of the North American indigenous peoples, in the Pacific, in the Caribbean, and throughout the resistance's international solidarity. We produce our Freedom Now program on the unceded land of the Tongva Nation here in North Mexico, where KPFK is located in Los Angeles. Today's program covers Black women's racism and U.S. imperialism via the CIA using Black operatives masquerading here in Los Angeles during the 1960s to infiltrate liberation movements. Our agenda for today, Saturday, July 6, 2024, we commence with our sister Luyanda Kaboka and the African Drumbeat Historical Calendar. Then, we will hear a prison radio commentary from Umia Abu Jamal on the Imperial Court for an Imperial President. This hour, prolific author, radical historian, professor of African American Studies at the University of Houston, and Freedom Now co-producer, Dr. Gerald Horne interviews Dr. Simone Drake, the Youngberg Distinguished Professor of English at The Ohio State University in Columbus, and co-author of the book, Black Women's Story of Everyday Racism, Narrative Analysis for Social Change. And later in the hour, Dr. Horne interviews Herb Boyd, longtime journalist and writer with the New York Amsterdam News in Harlem, and co-editor of The Diary of Malcolm X and author of the forthcoming book, Malcolm X, The CIA and the Blacks. Our music clip mix includes MLK, Zap Mama, Hiromi, Ornette Coleman, Ben Patterson, Chembo Cornel, Nate Najjar, and more. So sit back, phone a friend, and as always we stand, ready for revolution.
Molweni Ekaya. This is Sister Luyanda Kaboka with Freedom Now's weekly African Drumbeat historical calendar with significant dates and events that reflect the struggle of the oppressed for the week of July 4th. July 4th, 1930. The Nation of Islam was founded by Master Fard Muhammad. The nation continues in the tradition of African nationalist religious movements which seek to spiritually and politically better the conditions of African prisoners of the European slavocracies and wars on Africa. The Nation of Islam has produced great leaders such as Minister Malcolm X, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, and Minister Louis Farrakhan, and more importantly has transformed thousands of men from predators of the community to soldiers in the struggle of righteousness against Western decadence. July 5th, 1962. Algeria gains independence after an 8-year guerrilla war where over 1 million Africans gave their lives against French colonialism. Ahmad Ben Bella and Frantz Fanon are two among many whose spirit and ideological skills became role models for the continued liberation movements that occurred, best immortalized in the film Battle of Algiers, where the twin evils of colonialism and neocolonialism are exposed. July 6th, late 19th century, Sarah Noir, warrior queen of the Asnas, who in early 1999, through brilliant tactical maneuvering and the creative promulgation of her reputation as a witch demoness, successfully defended her African kingdom from the advancing forces of French capitalism. July 7th, 1954. TANU, the Tanganyika African National Union, which was the movement of national liberation of the microstate of Tanzania, begins the mass protest confrontation stage of struggle against British colonialism through countrywide strikes and boycotts. July 7th, 1975. Melba Hernandez, a Cuban guerrilla and a member of the July 26 movement with Fidel Castro, helps launch the Cuban Revolution. Melba was a founding member of the Cuban Communist Party and was brutally tortured by the Batista neocolonial government. July 9th, 1972, more than 3,000 Chicano workers, 85% of whom were Chicana women, went on strike against the Farah Pants Company in El Paso, Texas. They walked out demanding a union. July 10th, 1875. Mary McLeod Bethune was born in Maysville, South Carolina, one of 17 children of Samuel and Patsy McLeod, former slaves. Mary worked in the cotton fields with her family. She founded the Daytona Normal and Industrial Institute for Negro Girls, now known as Bethune-Cookman College, in 1904. And she served as president from 1904 to 1942 and from 1946 to 1947. She was a leader in the Black Women's Club movement and served as president of the National Association of Colored Women. She was one of the founders of National Council of Negro Women. Vice president of the NAACP, was awarded the Haitian Medal of Honor and Merit, that country's highest award. And in Liberia, she received the honor of Commander of the Order of the Star of Africa. This has been Sister Luyanda Koboka with Freedom Now, 90.7 FM in Southern California and 98.7 FM in Santa Barbara. Streaming live on www.kpfk.org. If you have any questions or comments, email us at freedomnow@kpfk.org. And in the language of resistance in South Africa, as the listening audience, join us in our chant for freedom. Amandla awethu, Amandla awethu, Amandla awethu.
An imperial court for an imperial president. Over half a century ago, U.S. President Richard M. Nixon told TV interviewer David Frost the following on May 19, 1977. When the president does it, that means it is not illegal. Of course, Nixon resigned in the face of the Watergate scandal. Half a century has passed. And in the case Trump versus United States, The Supreme Court has enshrined that principle into law, calling it official immunity. The court has endorsed a theory known as the unitary executive power, where the president is impervious to prosecution as long as he or she acts in their official capacity. Moreover, the president is choosing his own judges, also gets to choose his own judgments. Remember that old saying, no man is above the law? That is no longer the case. For a majority of the U.S. Supreme Court, 6 justices has ruled if that man is the president, he now has official immunity. What that also means is that the former president, except for his New York prosecution, may not see the inside of another courtroom. One justice, dissenter Sonia Sotomayor, suggests the U.S. president might as well be called king. This is judicial conservatism gone mad. With love, not fear. This is Mumia Abu Jamal.
These commentaries are recorded by Prison Radio.
For KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Simone Drake, Youngberg Distinguished Professor of English at The Ohio State University in Columbus and co-author of the book Black Women's Stories of Everyday Racism, Narrative Analysis for Social Change. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Professor Drake.
Thank you for having me, Professor Horne.
And thank you for joining us. So, how did this book come together? How did it come to be?
Well, I was not at the original formation of it kind of coming to be. It started with a project that a public health scholar and community engagement scholar, Jack Turman, was working on. So the women that are part of our collaboration, they already had been working with Jack on like community engagement projects, I think, around Black women's health, and particularly like maternal health. And then somehow he met James Phelan, who is one of the co-authors, one of the narrative studies scholars from Ohio State University. There are 3 of us that are at Ohio State, and one that's at the University of Kentucky. And I am the kind of outlier in the sense that I am not trained in narrative studies. That is not the work that I do. But Jack thought it would be good for people to hear the actual kind of human side of these experiences. So hear these women's stories and have them analyzed in a way that's, very different from like clinical or biomedical science research that focuses really on like medical intervention or taking it outside of medicine, like social and public policy. So that's kind of how it came to be. We decided we would listen to these women's stories, and in the book, one thing that is noted is that I'm the only African American scholar on the faculty side of this, right, on the researcher side, and so there were some deference to me, and one of the things that I thought was very important was not to just focus on the ways in which, in some various ways in which structural racism might have defeated these women, and I encouraged not to take an entire exclusively deficit approach, but to also allow them to tell a story in which they feel like they experienced structural racism, but they were pleased with the ways in which they navigated, or they felt like they somehow got over on that experience. And so we paired that with stories in which they felt like they were not as successful.
Now, were most of these Black women in Ohio?
No, they were all in central Indiana. We had funding from Foundation in central Indiana and some other places, but one stipulation was that all of the women needed to live in central Indiana. I think all of them did actually lived in Indianapolis except for one. Yes, and Jack Turman is at a university in Indiana, so I think because he's the one who found the funding, it worked out that way.
And what about the age range of these Black women?
So yes, as far as the selection of the participants or our interlocutors, they are diverse by age. Like one was a college student all the way to retirees, by education, educational levels, formal educational levels, as well as types of careers. So we had a very kind of diverse group.
So how does your book illustrate racism in healthcare vis-a-vis Black women?
Okay, so, and there were a couple of people, actually, Latoya was one of the women who talked about postpartum health issues, and not being listened to, and really not being given proper care. However, most of the stories ended up not necessarily being about healthcare. So that is, even though that is sort of how these, I think, women, my understanding is how these women all came to work with Professor Turman, our funders did want it to be broader than just healthcare, and not to just focus on that. And so it was really open to them to tell any stories that they wanted to. So some, specifically talked about in the workplace, some talked about it in education, some talked about it in kind of social kinds of interactions. And so we did not end up with a very heavy focus or representation of experiences in healthcare.
And how does your book illustrate racism with regard to business?
Yes. So there are a number of, actually, I think I'd say education and workplace were the two areas where we had the most number of stories that were chosen to be told. And it was quite a range. Like, one woman, Mary Bullock, talks about, all the way, she's now retired, but talked about as a teenager working and coming to the realization that the two white male teenagers she worked at kind of like, I think it's sort of like a kind of mom and pop kind of restaurant, that they were making more than her. And when she approached her employer and said, they're making X amount of money and I'm making this, and that's not fair, he told her that that he was paying them more because they needed the money to buy something. And she said, well, she needed the money too. And he just told her, well, that's the way it's going to be, and if you don't like it, you can go work somewhere else. And her second story kind of was a fast forward to, she was a social worker, and when she found had an experience with a white male colleague who was not as experienced with her. It was not as experienced as her. Was promoted, and without even any real kind of formal procedural process. And when she challenged that, she was literally told by her boss that it is a white man's world, and the sooner that she understood that, the easier it would be for her to navigate through it. And it had real ramifications when she, later in her career, at the end of her career, she looked up where that man was, and I believe it was $279,000 that he was making. That was more than her salary at retirement. So her stories were really, I think, enlightening around employment and in the business world, and the ways in which structural racism works, not just in income, but in the production of wealth. And so, and there were other women who talked about, things like being, two Black women being mistaken for one another, and human resources not considering that to be a problem. So those are two examples of the workplace, but in general, the workplace was probably the most significant location of stress and anxiety.
And what about law enforcement? How does that figure into your stories?
Yeah, there was one story about there was one story someone told about in their youth, where her father was stopped by military police, and held for an extended period of time, and for no real infraction, other than perhaps being a Black man with a brand new truck. And she talks about just having to seeing her father in that state, who she described as this big, strong man who changed truck tires, and being put in a position where he couldn't talk back, he couldn't defend himself, and he was not being treated as a citizen, as a full citizen. I'm trying to think. I think that's the only one that was directly engaging with law enforcement.
And what about education and schools?
A lot with education. And from different perspectives. So two women told stories about their own experiences in secondary school, and with guidance counselors not supporting them going to college, or not supporting the type of college that they wanted to go to. And then one of the two of those women who told the stories about the guidance counselors also told a story about her own child, her son, when he was in elementary school, and the teacher discriminating against him in class, and actually a community member who she didn't really know came to us, I think, a hair supply shop that she owned, and told her she needed to go check on her son, that she needed to go to his school. And when she went, she saw that I think he had been placed in a corner where he was facing away from the classroom and like looking outside, and not receiving proper instruction. And so her and her husband removed him from that school. And she had an anecdote that that child is now a physician. and both of those women, I thought it was interesting and really appreciated that they both thought about how they really wanted to go back and, one, ask those guidance counselors why they didn't believe in them, why they did not really want to see their fullest potential, and to also tell them that they made it anyways, because one woman is a principal and the other is a professor of English and Africana Studies now.
So, go ahead, sorry.
Oh no, and there were some others with education. Another one is one of our younger participants who was actually in college at the time, told a story about an English class where the professor kind of called her out as the Black voice, right, as the representative of Black people, and wanting to know, when they were reading, I think, Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe, about her experiences. But it was a situation where she talked about the two white male students who were sitting next to her. They registered it was inappropriate. Because they said to each other, "Did you hear what she said?" She being the professor. But no one said anything. No one said that's wrong, or why are you asking her a question like that? And she reflected a lot on how she liked the class. But that situation really kind of tainted the experience.
Tainted indeed. So finally, Professor Drake Youngberg, Distinguished Professor of English at The Ohio State University in Columbus, co-author of the book Black Women's Stories of Everyday Racism, Narrative Analysis for Social Change. With regard to the younger folk in our audience, would you recommend study at The Ohio State University?
Oh, yes, I always recommend pursuing higher education. And Ohio State's a really large school, so I think pretty much whatever you might want to do, the odds are we have a major in that area.
So I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, Professor Drake at The Ohio State University. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you very much for having me.
This is Sister Flora, and you are listening to Freedom Now at KPFK 90.7 FM in occupied Mexico, including Los Angeles, 98.7 FM Santa Barbara, 93.7 FM in San Diego, and streaming live on the web at kpfk.org. Today's program, as well as 10 prior editions, can be reheard at kpfk.org/audio archive, and scroll down to Freedom Now. From 12 to 1 p.m., following Freedom Now is your sister Assunta, with Spotlight Africa addressing issues facing Mother Africa. For a truly alternative international perspective on world affairs, check out RTTV Russia, CCTV China, and online at Presna, Latina Cuba Telesur Venezuela, News 24 South Africa, and Press TV Iran. We will now continue with historian Professor Dr. Gerald Horne.
For Pacifica Radio, KPFK in Los Angeles, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Herb Boyd, longtime journalist and writer with the New York Amsterdam News in Harlem, co-editor of the Diary of Malcolm X, and co-author of the forthcoming book, Malcolm X, the CIA, and the Blacks. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Herb Boyd.
Thank you very much, Gerald. It's always a pleasure to be with you. we've been connected in so many ways over the years, and I think this continues a very formidable relationship that we have as we delve into the politics, geopolitics, the kind of Pan-Africanists and Marxist-Leninists and all the other ideological developments around the issues of the African diaspora. So you continue that discussion, and it's always a pleasure to be with you because I know you're going to probe me and get into some things where we can both share our impressions of our long-time activism.
Now, your forthcoming book starts with the vignette about Leo Milas. Who was he? What was his connection to Los Angeles? And what was his connection to Mozambique and Southeast Africa?
Well, he is, for me, the book that's coming out, I do in collaboration with Don Rojas, whom you know very well in terms of his own connection with liberation struggles. But what you have to understand is a real connection with Leo Milas. That's my what you might call good fortune to have. And I only made that discovery, Gerald, as a consequence of being someone who has been almost always interested in the geopolitics and the global politics of this country, and certainly as it pertains to the African continent, to say nothing of Malcolm X's life. So it's a conjunction of my interest in Malcolm and what was going with liberation movements in Africa that brings Leo Milas into perspective. When I was discovering him in the diary, the only reason he brought my attention was that his name kept popping up. I'm following Malcolm as he moves. He visited almost 16 countries doing the 2 tours that he made of North Africa and as well as the Middle East and West Africa too. I can't forget Ghana and then Guinea and Liberia, where he also visited. But here's this man that he meets in a hotel, and as a result of that, they form some kind of ongoing conversation. Interestingly enough, he's popping up in each of the countries, at least 3 of the countries that Malcolm visited. You wonder, what's going on with that? How is he following him, and for what purpose? So in following that life, the name hit me. Say, wait a minute, I've seen this name before. And that's as a consequence of going into my research on what was happening with the liberation movements. And one of the first books I published was called, dealing with the liberation struggles in Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau. That's where his name stuck in my mind, y'all. So as I'm going through the diary, I said, wait a minute, let me stop for a moment and find out what is the connection, the possible relationship with this man. Is it just a coincidence that he has a name that is stuck in my mind all these many years? So I stopped what I was doing, went into the research on him, followed his life, picked it up with Frelimo. I said, aha, that's where I heard it. I think I read it in John Malcolm's book. I think I had seen it in a couple of correspondence coming with the African revolutionaries in Mozambique and Angola, as well as Guinea-Bissau. So I started putting it all together and saying, now, wait a minute, he is expelled. They kick him out of Frelimo in 1962. Now, a lot of people who are like Africanists and African authorities and doing their research and liberation movements and stuff, they have run across him. However, they don't extend it beyond 1962 when he's expelled from Frelimo. So it's my speculation, and of course Don joins me in this, that after that, because if he has this connection with the government agencies, and of course it goes all the way back to him masquerading, because he went to the University of Southern California and perhaps a couple of other institutions on the West Coast. But he ends up in a film, Gerald, in 1953 with Susan Hayward and Robert Mitchum and called White Witch Doctor. His name was not Miles then, it was Leo C. Aldrich. So then I started doing research on who is this Leo C. Aldrich, because his name sometimes is mentioned in association with Leo Miles. True enough, it's one and the same person. Goes all the way back to him being born in Texas and migrating to California, going to school out there, studying Romance languages, particularly Portuguese and Spanish, ends up later on, heaven only knows, because I lose track of him between 1953 and when he merges 9 years later or 8 years later, he's off in Mozambique, because now he's creating and fabricating this here new persona. He's no longer Leo C. Aldrich. He is now Leo Miles and has insinuated himself in the liberation movements in Mozambique. He convinces, and maybe he must have been a pretty good actor and impersonator, but he convinced members of Frelimo, including Eduardo Mondlane, that he is in fact a native of Mozambique. Although many people felt that, hey, he doesn't have the language quality linguistically, he's not connected with any of the ethnic groups or tribal groups of Mozambique. So there was some concerns right away. People scratching their heads, wait a minute, this guy really from Mozambique? But they didn't dwell on that. But he emerges there, hooks up with Mondlane. Mondlane brings him in. And again, that's a kind of a very mysterious relationship and what was going on there, because the accusations were going forth that Mondlane was also affiliated, connected, working as in concert with the CIA. And in fact, if that's true, then it makes the logic of it applies that he would be associated with Leo Miles. Not to say that agents within organizations really know each other. We've discovered that with the assassination of Malcolm X, that many of at least 5 members of BASI was in the Audubon Auditorium at that time, and they didn't know each other. So it's a lot of mystery connected there, but the important thing for us, Gerald, is that here's this here pivot. For me, he was the spur. He's the, what you call the connecting tissue that brings all of this here stuff together in the supposition that he is operative. He's some kind of operative, some kind of agent that's affiliated and working in conjunction with the CIA. There's a lot of circumstantial evidence there, but nothing conclusive. Of course, nothing can actually ever be conclusive about the mysterious workings of the CIA. So that's where it begins, Joe.
Mm-hmm. So just to sum up, here you have this guy with roots in Texas and in Southern California, University of Southern California in Los Angeles, studies Romance languages, particularly Portuguese, winds up in Southeast Africa, where he's masquerading as a Mozambican. Interestingly enough, the founding father of modern Mozambique, Eduardo Mondlane, takes him in. And of course, Mondlane is mysteriously assassinated a few years later. Then he crosses paths with Malcolm X as Malcolm X is touring in Africa. It is a curious story indeed, which brings us to J. Kennedy, another man who has roots in the Southland in Southern California, who was close at one time to both Harry Belafonte and Elaine Brown of the Black Panther Party. What can you tell us about J. Kennedy?
Well, he's another individual that's pretty hard to nail in terms of his affiliations and associations. But Gerald, let me conclude a couple of statements on Miles before we dispense with him. One of the things is that is he dead? When did he die? And then what's his legacy then after his association with Malcolm X, those meeting with Malcolm X? What happened to him then? Because we know that he had these meetings in 3 different countries with Malcolm, but then he disappears on the pages of history. Well, I discovered that in 2003, he came out with a book called Sharing the Nile. Sharing the Nile is a study of the water rights between Egypt and Ethiopia. And he's then affiliated with the United Nations. That makes logic. That's logical because he moves from one government agency into this here larger connection with the United Nations. And of course, that's often presumed that there's a tight relationship there between the UN and a number of U.S. governmental agencies, UNICEF included. So anyway, here he is now working in Ethiopia, as a so-called water expert. And then I had a fortunate to be in touch with one of his former lovers. And Dar es Salaam then plays a key part in all of this. Of course, I've been in and out of Dar es Salaam at least a half a dozen times myself, going all the way, including the 1974 six-pack. But while I'm there, I made connections with a number of my on-the-ground individuals who informed me about what was happening there. I had no idea that Suzanne was one of his former lovers. So I had email contacts with her. She shared with me a number of the letters and correspondence that she had with Leo Miles. Of course, by now his name is changed. He's gone from Leo C. Aldridge to Leo Miles to Saiful Aziz Miles, and writing for a number of very strange publications coming out of the Horn of Africa. So anyway, the research now is being continued on Miles by two scholars at Concordia University up in Montreal, Andrew Avaska and James Brennan. I've been in touch with them. In fact, the email I received from Andrew told me that Miles died in 2016. When the book came out that he did on Sharing the Nile in 2003, but there was articles that go beyond that, which makes it kind of problematic. If he's dead in 2016, these articles are popping up, although they could have been held and then released upon his death. So there be some confusion and conflict there, but it's easily determined that he could have written them in advance of his death. Obviously, he did. So anyway, that kind of concludes the research on Leo Miles, and we have to wait now with Andrew and James's book coming out, and they've been promising to come out with this book for a couple of years now. I don't know where they are on the research, but that might bring a lot of these things together. Although when I was in correspondence with them, they knew little about his association hanging and meeting with Malcolm X. So again, we're going to have to do a little bit more research, and the CIA doesn't help us in terms of documents. Donna and I have received all kind of parcels of information, but most of it is redacted. It's just blacking out. Maybe one day we'll get a chance to get beyond the blackening out of these documents and see who these individuals were and what exactly was discussed. Now, all of this here pivots then on the notion of what's going on. The book itself, we're saying that if Leo Miles is kind of about the crux of it, then what about all these other blacks? So that's what we do. We use that particular story and extend it and make it touch upon what's happening generally in terms of the African diaspora as relates to the American government, and a number of other activists out there who came under in the crosshairs of the CIA over the years. And that list is long and deep, and we probe each one of them. So I think the lifeblood of the book then is looking at a number of African Americans and Caribbeans who are under the microscope, in the crosshairs of the CIA, and many of them, the accusations that go back and forth between, for example, Carlos Moore and Richard Gibson, was said about people like a William Worthy and his movements, and the radical journalists at those times began to point out, what's going on with the surveillance the heavy surveillance. And of course, people say, well, so what? He was under surveillance. They didn't really do anything to him. But Malcolm could have been affected by all of this in so many ways that he could have, the whole sickness that he occurred almost daily over there, if you read his diary, he was possibly being, poisoned by agents of the government. Who knows? Of course, Miles could have been a part of all that. There's speculation on our parts. But more than anything, you have a situation where the surveillance itself, may not have been that critical. It certainly didn't stop Malcolm. Even he suspected that he was under surveillance. That didn't stop him in his pursuit in terms of trying to find some answers to the systemic racism and discrimination, the absolute anti-imperialist attitude that he had in this country. And as aligning himself with all these other, leaders of Africa, the Caribbean, say nothing of the Middle East. He insinuated himself in that situation knowingly, and no matter what happened. And they tried to keep him from going back to the United States. Say, man, your life, you're in danger. They burned down your house, they threatened your family. But Malcolm has said that, well, okay, I'm already a walking dead man. That's something that he recognized, and it didn't stop his pursuit, Gerald, and the kind of mission he had to kind of disclose the nefarious things that was happening in this country to African-American people in particular, and the global implications of that. So that's where the CIA and Malcolm and then the blacks come into the title. That's what Don and I are trying to do, is to uncover and show that long association goes all the way back to Marcus Garvey. When it wasn't the CIA, it was the Bureau of Investigation, the kind of work that Jeffrey Perry did before his death. And then picking it up across the years, all through what was happening with COINTELPRO. That hasn't been thoroughly probed. The Church Commission, all these different documents that came, the kind of surveillance that was going up with the disinformation campaign that was put up against the Black Panther Party and a number of other organizations, even the internal conflict that they created there. All of that is part and parcel of understanding the ramifications, the implications of the CIA in terms of trying to offset, destroy any possibility of an organized fight, against the imperialism, capitalism, racism in America.
And as suggested previously, J. Richard Kennedy was an author, screenwriter, composer, publisher, record executive, and Harry Belafonte's business manager, in addition to being an FBI spy. What are you able to share with us about his nefarious story?
Not too much, because I think what David Garrow has done, and I borrow extensively on David's work with the FBI. In terms of the CIA and J. Kennedy, I don't have that much information about that connection. We know that, when the FBI and the CIA are like cousins, they're joined at the spine. They share information all the time. So what I know about that is what David Garrow was pointing out in his book in terms of Dr. King and the role of the FBI in terms of the surveillance and in interviewing, the obstacles that they presented, and as well as a lot of people don't understand that when a government agency has you in their crosshairs, the pressure they put upon you, even with the suspicion that that you're being watched every moment. To what extent does that have an impact on what you do, your policy, your practice, what you have to say, and your movements and what have you. So all of that comes into play. And with Kennedy coming into contact with so many other members, it's similar to what Garrow talks about in terms of Stan Levinson inside of the organization. What I think the best authority on that, Gerald, is probably, I think, Clarence Jones, who was Dr. King's attorney. In his book, he spells out a lot of the intrigue. And some of these players that we're talking about right now who were in and around Dr. King at that time, And then extending beyond that, like Abaya Rusting, for example, he has to be brought into discussion, clarified, because there's an accusation that he was some operative for the CIA when it goes into parts of down and going into the Caribbean, that he may have been involved there. That's a speculation that we pose in the book. So in terms of Jay Kennedy, I mean, he was not like a principal player for our research. First of all, who is he? What is he all about? It was never clear for us other than what David Garrow had to say.
Now, your co-author, Don Rojas, is also a subject in your pages, insofar as he was in Grenada, the Caribbean island, at the time of the U.S. invasion of 1983. What are you sharing in this forthcoming book about your co-author, Don Rojas?
But one of the things is that at first, there's a young woman now, not so young anymore, but she was in Detroit with me and working with a number of political organizations there. She left Detroit and moved to Mexico, to Oaxaca. Ultimately, she ends up in Oaxaca, but before that, she moved to Grenada. And I stayed in correspondence with her. It was in 1983, just prior to the invasion of Grenada by the U.S. military, that I received a letter from her inviting me to come to Grenada. Gerald, she was so passionately excited about the political developments that was going on in that country that I would, as a journalist, as an activist and an intellectual, someone who's interested in global political developments, she said, "You better come here because this is the future." Of course, she's talking about the revolutionary government that has been established there, by Maurice Bishop and his comrades. And of course, Don Rojas at that time was working, as a director of information, his secretary of sorts. So I didn't know Don at that point. I just knew Michelle. That's the woman who now lives in Oaxaca, who at that time was very intensely inviting me to come there and look at how this revolutionary government is developing. I didn't follow up on her. As I thought about it, that's when the invasion occurred. It's going to be, oh my goodness, like 6 years later that Don Rojas now is at the Amsterdam News, where he had worked previously. Now he's back working with Bill Tatum there. He is a new editor. So we bond. And I tell him about Michelle. He says, "Yeah, I know Michelle very well. She was with us. She's a very, very significant activist and one we're highly respected." So I told him about the invitation I received, that I might have met him earlier and not some 6-7 years later when he arrives at the Amsterdam News. And it's out of that particular bonding that the kind of shared experiences we had, the outlook, a very similar kind of ideological, political perspective. And we began to put our heads together after he left the Amsterdam News and then worked with the NAACP with Ben Chavis at that time. And then when that ended, he came back and we started the Black World Today. So we've been in that connection a long time. But one of the things that Don, I wish I had a little bit more influence on him, because his story on what happened with the Grenada Revolution and its demise is a riveting story. I mean, his life, they were looking for him. And he was lucky enough to get away and go to the Russian embassy and hide out there while all this turbulence and turmoil is going on with the U.S. invasion. His family, he's separated from his family. They're moving in a separate direction. And so what happens is he ends up in Prague, Czechoslovakia. He's in Prague. So he's over in Europe at that time when a lot of this is happening. And he begins to have an affiliation with the kind of a universal, International Journalists Association. They provide him a certain kind of, a platform to write from. and certain kind of support in terms of movement, going from one place to another, talking about, what happened in Grenada. One of the things that people need to understand is that Don has that whole story, and I've been trying to convince him to tell it, and maybe one day he's done articles on it, and I've worked with him. I know during one of our trips to Haiti, he was my bunkmate on the Royal Princess lines that went down there, courtesy of the Institute of the Black World. And Gerald, he kept me up all night telling me exactly what happened to him as a result of the invasion. It was so riveting, I couldn't go to sleep. I stayed up for the next 2 hours and wrote down everything that he told me. I recently published that in the Amsterdam News, kind of a recounting on the anniversary of the Maurice Bishop's death. And he saw it, and I was hoping that'd be a stimulus to go ahead him and do his book on this thing. Well, that's to be seen. Some portions of it, he talks about it in this here new book that's coming out. There's a chapter in there, and he deals with not only with Grenada, but all the way Guyana, which of course is another critical part of our story, and looking at the CIA's advance into looking at Cuba, what's happening in Grenada, Jamaica, and Trinidad. All of these countries come into play as we look at certain individuals like a C.L.R. James, George Padmore. These individuals who also did not escape the scrutiny and the nefarious intentions of the CIA. So that's all part of this kind of potpourri, of activists who at some point are conjoined, at some part are part of the same organizations, same institutions, working in the same capacity to undo and taking anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist stances in this country. They all are discussed to some extent, not thoroughly, because we don't have that capacity to do it all in this particular book. But I think we touch on enough things there that hopefully in a generation or so, new scholars coming forward can take this as a premise, and they can begin to, by that time, maybe we'll have like a release, some of those documents that these agencies have concealed from us over these years. And they'll have the province of that to go ahead and further this analysis and bring it to some kind of conclusion about what happened to these individuals at that time, when we were struggling with the liberation struggles across the globe were going on. And whether we get some kind of clarity in understanding it's what could have been done and what was done, too, because we need a thoroughgoing analysis of that, Gerald.
Thoroughgoing analysis, indeed, which readers will certainly find in your forthcoming book, co-authored with the aforementioned Don Rojas, Malcolm X, CIA, and the Blacks. Thank you, Herb Boyd, longtime journalist, New York, Amsterdam News in Harlem, for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you, Gerald, anytime, and I hope to see you soon.
Ditto.